The judge's gavel, a sharp crack against polished wood, seemed to echo the sound of my own heart fracturing. My mother, perched in the front row, let out a soft, dismissive sniff. Across the aisle, my father's lips curled into a smirk, a familiar, unpleasant twist that always settled like grit in my gut. Honestly, her voice, barely a whisper but carrying with the clarity of a stage whisper in a hushed theater, cut through the low murmur of the courtroom. It's all just a bit dramatic, isn't it? Such a fuss over nothing. My father gave a low chuckle, a sound that scraped against my nerves. It was the sound of absolute certainty, the certainty of people who have never, not once, been challenged. The courtroom, sterile and imposing, suddenly felt like a stage for their private amusement, and I, the unwilling prop. My life had always been a careful balancing act around their whims. Growing up, I learned to read the subtle shifts in their moods, the almost imperceptible tightening of my mother's jaw, the way my father's eyes would glaze over when displeased. Their approval was a currency I desperately tried to earn, a phantom limb I constantly felt the absence of. Every achievement, no matter how significant, was met with a lukewarm nod, a backhanded compliment that somehow diminished the accomplishment. When I graduated top of my class, my mother had said, "Well, it's about time. We knew you had it in you, though we always worried you'd get distracted by these sorts of things." These sorts of things was a vague indictment of my entire existence, a constant subtle suggestion that I was somehow less capable, less than I should be. There was the time I'd poured all my meager savings, scraped together from years of part-time jobs, into a small business venture. It was a modest dream, a little artisan bakery, something I'd poured my heart into. I'd painstakingly drawn up a business plan, secured a small loan, and found the perfect little shop front. When I'd excitedly presented it to them, expecting, perhaps, a sliver of encouragement, my father had taken the proposal, skimmed it with an air of profound boredom, and then tossed it back on the coffee table. "A bakery? Really? You think you can make a living selling overpriced bread and cakes? We'll see how long this lasts. Probably another phase." My mother had added, with a sigh that dripped condescension, "Just don't expect us to be bailing you out when it fails. We have our own financial plans, you know." Their words, delivered with such casual finality, had felt like a physical blow, the hope draining out of me like water from a sieve. I'd eventually gone ahead, of course, driven by a stubborn refusal to let their negativity become my reality, but their pronouncements had planted seeds of doubt that took years to uproot. Then there was the inheritance. Not a vast fortune, but enough that it meant something. My grandmother, a woman who had loved me fiercely and understood me in ways my parents never could, had left me a significant portion, enough to provide a safety net, a stepping stone. My parents, on the other hand, received less, a fact that seemed to chafe them deeply. I remember the day after the funeral, the hushed whispers in the kitchen. My mother was meticulously polishing my grandmother's silver teapot, her movements sharp and agitated. "It's just not fair," she'd muttered, "not to me, but to the teapot. She always did favor you. Always saw something special. Perhaps she just didn't realize how impractical some people can be." My father, leaning against the doorframe, had added, his voice low and venomous, "Don't worry. There are ways to equalize things. These things have a way of working themselves out." I'd felt a cold dread creep up my spine then, a premonition I'd tried to ignore. They saw my inheritance not as a gift, but as a personal affront, an imbalance in the cosmic ledger that needed rectifying. The day in court was the culmination of a protracted, exhausting legal battle. It wasn't about money, not directly. It was about a deeply ingrained pattern of their control, their attempts to dictate my life choices, even to the extent of trying to dictate how I used my own property. They had, through a series of calculated maneuvers and outright lies, attempted to seize control of a small parcel of land I owned, land that had been part of my grandmother's estate and, by extension, mine. They claimed some obscure historical family right, a flimsy argument they'd concocted, I suspected, because they'd decided they wanted it, and I, by virtue of still possessing it, was an obstacle. The absurdity of their claim, the sheer gall of it, was what had finally pushed me past my breaking point. The courtroom was hushed, the air thick with anticipation. The judge, a stern woman with sharp eyes, had been listening intently to my lawyer's closing arguments. I had sat there, my hands clasped so tightly my knuckles were white, my gaze fixed and the wooden bench. Then it was my turn to speak. I'd taken a deep breath, the stale air filling my lungs. I didn't look at my parents. I couldn't. I focused on a point on the wall behind the judge, a small imperfection in the plaster. Your Honor, I began, my voice a little shaky at first, but gaining strength with each word. My parents, they have a history of believing that what is mine, is theirs. They have a history of disregarding my autonomy, my decisions, and my property. They have consistently belittled my efforts, undermined my confidence, and attempted to manipulate me into conforming to their expectations. This land, I paused, letting the weight of my words settle. This land represents more than just acreage. It represents a small piece of independence, a tangible symbol that I can build and own something that is solely mine, free from their influence. Their claims are not based on any legal precedent, but on a lifelong habit of entitlement and a desire to control every aspect of my life, even now, when I am a grown woman with my own assets. As I spoke, I felt a shift in the room. The low hum of whispers died down completely. My lawyer, who had been sitting with a professional, detached air, straightened in his seat, his eyes widening slightly. And then I saw it. The judge, who had been making meticulous notes, slowly, almost imperceptibly, stopped writing. Her head tilted slightly, her gaze fixed not on me, but on some unseen point in the middle distance, as if she were seeing something far beyond the confines of the courtroom. It wasn't just listening, it was absorption. Her expression, usually so impassive, softened, then hardened, a flicker of recognition, perhaps even understanding, crossing her features. The usual courtroom buzz, the shuffling of papers, the clearing of throats, had vanished. The silence that descended was profound, absolute. It was as if the entire room, for a fleeting moment, held its breath, captivated by the raw, unvarnished truth being laid bare. My mother's whispered comment about it being dramatic and my father's smug smirk had evaporated. In their place was a stunned, unnerving quiet. The judge's eyes, when they finally returned to me, held a gravity I'd never witnessed. She looked at me, then at my parents, and the contrast was stark. My parents, caught in their ingrained superiority, looked almost bewildered, as if their script had been abruptly rewritten without their consent. The judge's decision was swift and decisive. She didn't need further deliberation. She cited my testimony, not just as a statement of facts, but as evidence of a long-standing pattern of familial coercion. She made it abundantly clear that her ruling was based on my clear, articulate defense of my rights, and the undeniable pattern of undue influence and entitlement displayed by my parents. When she finally delivered her verdict, her voice was firm, resonating with an authority that left no room for appeal. My parents' faces fell, the initial shock giving way to disbelief, then a dawning, ugly realization. The smugness was gone, replaced by a tight-lipped fury. In the days that followed, the quiet execution of their defeat began. My father sent a barrage of increasingly frantic texts, demanding to know what I had. My mother, after an initial period of stony silence, started enlisting flying monkeys, various aunts and cousins who had always been eager to pass judgment, to relay messages of disappointment and manipulation. Your mother is heartbroken, Aunt Carol chirped over the phone, her voice laced with self-righteous concern. She just can't understand why you would do this to your own family. She said you've made a terrible mistake. I listened, my expression unreadable, offering no explanations, no apologies. I simply acknowledged their messages and continued with my life. The land remained mine, unburdened by their avarice. Their attempts to control my financial affairs, which they had always subtly implied they could influence, were met with an unyielding calm. I had consulted with a discreet financial advisor, and with his guidance, I had quietly moved certain assets, secured accounts, and made small but significant adjustments to my financial standing, all without fanfare or explanation. It wasn't about ostentatious wealth, but about creating impermeable barriers. Their social standing, while not obliterated, suffered a subtle but noticeable shift. Those who had always been eager to curry favor with them now hesitated, sensing a shift in power. The whispers in the family gatherings, once directed at my perceived shortcomings, now turned, albeit cautiously, towards their overreach and perceived injustice. The entitlement that had defined their existence had, for once, backfired, revealing them not as powerful manipulators, but as petty individuals thwarted by their own greed. The satisfaction wasn't in their public humiliation, but in the quiet, internal unraveling I knew they must be experiencing. The foundation of their ego, built on the premise of their absolute authority, had cracked. The judge's frozen gaze, my parents' stunned silence, had been the moment the illusion shattered. The subsequent fallout was merely the natural consequence. Their world, built on the bedrock of assuming I would always bend, had crumbled, leaving them adrift in the quiet aftermath of my unyielding resolve. There was no dramatic confrontation, no grand declaration of victory. Just the cold, clear knowledge that they had underestimated me, and that, finally, I had outlasted their attempts to control me. The silence that followed their defeat was the sweetest sound of all.